seat over there. Thank you so much. Doesn't she just exude grace? Look at her, such a beautiful thing. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for sharing the story of what you're doing for little people. It means a lot.
You know, I told you I'll talk to anyone who will listen.
You did. I love that. And I bet you've had to talk a lot as you've shared your story over the last 30 years. Thank you for coming. Will you tell us a little bit about where you grew up and when you first realized that you wanted to be a teacher? I really love that story when you were 9 years old.
All right. There were actually two teachers who had a major impact on me. The first one was when I was 9 years old, and I didn't know I was going to be a teacher at that point, but she was shaking her finger at one of those boys, and who was acting up in class, and I felt bad for him, and I watched her, and it just dropped in my head, I'm going to grow up to be a teacher, but I'm going to be a nice one.
I love that.
and then in 7th grade is when I guess you could call her my mentor, my model. Across the hall from us was a very strictly guided class of these children who sat docilely in their rows all day and churned out the paperwork. And
they walked in straight lines.
Yes, and they walked in very straight, silent lines. And then there was our class. And Miss Trader had us push our desks together and have lively discussions about the stories in the Basel readers. We did projects, and I remember my Grecian villa and finding the bits of tile from a nearby construction and building it with that. And then our class wrote plays and performed them for the poor unfortunates across the hall. And I remember also the end of the day when we would file out exuberant and noisy, and Miss Trader would be like this.
Exhausted.
On her desk, exhausted from handling our energy all day. But across the hall, the very tall teacher with the long, long green eyes would stand sedately at her door as her children filed quietly out. But Miss Trader, one more thing she did for me that I didn't realize at the time, of course, was going to impact my teaching in my school, was she had us write our own stories. And I discovered I love to write and that the other children liked to hear my stories.
Oh, I love that. So it sounds like you had one teacher who taught you what not to do, and then you had this lovely lady who taught you what you did want to do.
Yes.
Really beautiful. So you grew up, you went and got your education degree, yes, and you discovered Montessori, and that really lit you up a lot. And then you found yourself in an inner city school, an inner city charter school. Can you talk a little bit about your experience there? I found that just fascinating.
All right. Well, it was at a time when we were finding alternatives to forced busing.
Right.
And so this school was to be made up of an exact proportion of the children from North Dallas, the well-to-do families, and the children a few from East Dallas, and the local children who lived in the projects. And they were privy to all kinds of crime, relatives in the penitentiary, and abundant drugs flowing in and out of their environment.
Two really different worlds colliding.
Yes. And so we just kind of stuck them all in together in these classes and said, y'all get along now. And so I had plans to just love them and everything would be just fine. So I went there. I remember this was a while back, 40 years ago. And I had my high heels on and my tight skirt this one day and my
probably your pearls,
pearl necklace. Yeah. And so suddenly, tall, dark Lanisi and short, white Jared stood with their elbows like this, saying, "Your mama," and those are the fighting words. And then the fight was on. I had set up my room in a very interesting way on these shelves that were on rollers and a little bit topsy-turvy with all my brand new shining Montessori materials on them. And I saw those go over and split my skirt and kind of slid across the floor to get them to break up the fight. And the children across the hall all stood up going, woo! And so that was my introduction to just throwing them all in together for the first time. So it was very, very challenging. And the teachers took to having meetings about neck holes and washing their mouths out with soap. And I thought, this isn't exactly why I went into teaching. And I might just get right back out because I'm not willing to police these little people. I really want to love them. And the way things happen, something just dropped this book into my path.
As that works sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thomas Gordon's book, Teacher Effectiveness Training, and I learned that it was possible to guide children without punishment, without any kind of threats or authoritarianism, but through dialogue and mostly empathy. But for classrooms, he recommended having class meetings and agreeing on the rules you wanted for your class. And it was a consensus, so my input would be considered too, so that when they would agree on the rules and then someone would say, well, and if somebody doesn't obey the rule, they'll get this punishment, then I could say, well, I don't go along with that, because I didn't want punishment and negativity to be our motivators. I wanted our shared enjoyment of being a cooperative, collaborative society to be the motivation for every one of us. So I said, no more punishments. And for the first 2 months, it became more like a zoo than a classroom.
Yeah, and you stuck with it.
I had the boys spewing profanity and banging their desk, and girls crying rivers and begging me to get in control. And I just became more of a therapist than a teacher, just dialoguing, and guiding them. But looking back on it, I realized that that was like pus coming out of wounds.
Right, you were
All
healing
that was underneath the surface of artificial discipline. It can come out in real discipline, which the only kind is self-discipline. And that can only be inspired, not demanded. And so, after a couple of months, they became a civilized group of people in there. I think I guess the feedback I got that it was working came from a delegation from Japan that came to see how our Montessori experiment in the public schools was faring. And the principal told me that as he went from class to class, and still the others were a little better behaved than mine, but he felt that our class had the most Montessori-like spirit, that spirit of active, engaged and purposeful work that would have a low hum to it perhaps, but was self-disciplined.
And it comes from respect, right?
Yes.
You respected those kids as humans.
Yes.
You didn't try to control them, and it worked in that
Yes.
environment where I'm sure everyone told you it can't possibly work.
They did.
You stuck with it and you made it work, and then you knew that loving and nurturing was an actual way to act in a classroom. And you stayed there how long? How long were you at that school?
6 years.
6 years. And then you went off and did what?
Well, I wanted to start my own school.
Right.
And so my parents actually lived in El Paso, but my mother flew here to drive around to look for a property. We found this house on 6 acres. She thought she might live there part of the time, and I would build a little school on the acreage. My mother ended up passing on after about the first 6 years, and I inherited that property, which was full of trees and fields and what children need in
It's
nature.
a beautiful space. I would recommend that anybody who's interested in where you wish you had gone to school go out and visit it. It's called the Center for Living Ethics.
The
And
Living
you've-
Ethics School.
The Living Ethics School, and you've been doing this for 32 years.
Yes.
Can you tell them what it is that makes it different and necessary? The way that you do things there?
After I got my degree, that's when my college degree in education, then my real learning began. And I learned there were all these voices out there who've been telling us for over a century that we need to reach the soul of the child. Montessori was one, and she had her child society in the classroom where the children loved their work and chose their work. And John Holt, who was telling us that they learn more by living than by schooling. And Tolstoy, with the sign above his door that said, "Come and go freely." So all those local peasants would pile in one day and spend hours and hours discussing and reading great literature, and the next day not show up. And Howard Gardner, who said there are multiple intelligences, and these intelligences are keys into the child. They're not children, they're not carbon copies of one another. And then Richard Louv, Last Child in the Woods, who taught that they need nature. And he came up with his own label, NDD. It's the only one I agree with, Nature Deficit Disorder. And I think almost all of our children have it.
I know.
So all of these voices influence me. They're like over my shoulder daily.
One thing you mentioned, you were talking about how in indigenous cultures and family units, the children are there and immersed in everything that's happening all day. So what they're drawn to do the weaving or the cooking, and as they show up at 2 years old or 3 years old or 4 years old, they pay attention, and if somebody notices they're paying attention, they include them and teach them at whatever level that they're able to do. And there's so much learning that goes on in those cultures that we have just gotten rid of in ours by keeping them so busy and having them go to schools where we tell them what they're supposed to learn.
Exactly.
And you guys don't do that so much.
All the great teachers, and the indigenous village is an example of this, prove that their work needs to be meaningful. They deserve meaningful work. In the village, they see it going on by their elders, and they know how it will affect the group. It has value, so they want to enter in. Nowadays, we often speak of children as being lazy. They're not lazy. They're not naturally lazy. It's just that people need to be attracted to meaningful work. Young people need to be attracted to meaningful work, not just told to do reams and reams of paperwork and then tested on it.
And the nature deficit disorder that you mentioned, he went deeper than I had ever thought before, that like just taking them to the park and on nature walks and stuff is not really what he means. He's talking about the actual interaction of seeing how rain affects the ground and how seeds and how plants interact with each other, and that it's a part of our DNA that teaches us so much that we have removed our children from.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think you walked with me to Easttown, where the children play. We have these belts of trees. And they, whenever I trim the trees around the property, I always save branches for them because they love to follow the footsteps of humanity and build households for themselves. When I have missing spoons and forks and bowls and pans, I often see where they've ended up in Easttown in their households. They have a glorious time out there cooperating and also having property disputes. So it's valuable on many counts because then we mediate to solve these disputes over bits of rope or tires or cups or whatever it's about, or even whether or not somebody can go into somebody else's household.
Oh my gosh.
Glorious living opportunities for how to get along with each other.
Learning so much, and there's animals and plants, and you have seasons, and you have orchards, and you collect the fruit, and oh my gosh, they just learn so much out there. And we don't have time to talk about it too much today, but she has created this entire curriculum that is visual. It has some pictures, it has some stories, and so as you're as you're watching the picture, you recreate the picture if you want to, if you feel like it. Excuse me. And as she's telling the story, you're learning about science and math and history, and not in a way that you have to memorize and then regurgitate on a test, but in a story, which is how we learn and process things
Yes.
best. It's really beautiful. The amount of work you've put in really completely blows my mind. Can you tell anybody that's watching who has loved what you've said today, what can they do to support your school?
Well, when young parents are so anxious and fearful for their children that they won't get to college, now the concern is if they don't start at 4 years old, which is an abomination.
Right.
Putting pencils and papers in their hands, just
Judging them.
Yes, remind them of the child's nature. And it's like we're taking care of nature out there. Now it's time to care for the child's nature. If I can say just a little bit
yes,
about
please,
those
absolutely.
teaching stories.
Yes.
That's another aspect of the Native American life, is that, or indigenous people all over the world, to teach their children history and science and all the different subjects. They weave together knowledge and wisdom. They speak to the heart and the head at the same time. And they're cultivating the imagination, a major, major artery of real intelligence,
Right.
which is inventive, creative. It designs and empathizes. That's the forebrain. And so I've spent 25 years writing those stories to do that. Yes, while they're art making, while they're learning, they're meant to be relaxed, happy, their brain open when they're learning. It's not about putting them on trial for their lives with one
Right.
test after another.
Right. I love that so much. Thank you for the good work you're doing in the world and letting all these kids just be themselves. Your school, is it a nonprofit?
It is nonprofit.
It is a nonprofit. So if someone
Yes.
wanted to help in that way, they could, because that's a
That's
constant
always welcome.
challenge for any
There's
nonprofit.
never enough
yeah.
funds.
And you give tours, right? If anybody wanted to come visit and see you guys, they
Sure,
could.
sure.
It's very cool. It's
I'd
up in
love to give
McKinney.
tours.
It's just an amazing, to me, it's just illustrative that it can happen and we can do it that way. And we don't have to stay committed to this organization, the way we've set up school. I really appreciate what you're doing, Vicki.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Can you
Thanks
guys
for
help me
having me.
thank her for coming?
Thank you.